wanted to welcome everyone this evening, and I really thank you for coming. My name is Janice Landis. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the current president of the Hampton Bays Civic Association. We're so pleased and appreciative of having a wonderful guest panel tonight. We want to talk about the water concerns that we all have as a community and the positive side of it, the methods to mitigate what's going on now, what hopefully is on the pathway to the future. Right now we have a terrific panel in the center, John Bouvier, councilman for Southampton Town, and I assume you probably know most of the panelists. Then to his right are Ed Warner Jr., president of the trustees, Scott Horowitz, treasurer of the trustees. To his left is Janice Scherer, and I always kill her title, but I think it's assistant director of long-range planning for Southampton Town. Okay, and then Ross Slotnick is on the end. He very kindly, Bridget Fleming had originally confirmed to come and had a last-minute cancellation. He's her deputy of staff, and he kindly agreed to come and be a part of the panel.
Hey now.
So what I'd like to do now is if everybody could stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, I would appreciate it. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now we're hoping that tonight will be a wonderful give and take discussion within the community. But before we launch into that, we have a few sort of housekeeping items to take care of. And we also have a wonderful situation where the HBCA presents a scholarship every year, and we have our scholarship recipient tonight. So first of all, what I'd like to just mention is that the minutes from our last meeting, April 23rd, which was, again, a community discussion about sidewalks, bike paths, and schools, they're available up front and online. We were very thrilled that Thomas Neely, who is Director of Traffic and Safety Control for Southampton, was one of our guest speakers at the meeting, and he has followed up with an ad hoc meeting that he is planning. One of the gentlemen, Andy Morris, who attended our meeting, he had some wonderful plans about bike paths, and we had him present to the HBCA board, and he's going to be part of this ad hoc committee. The local bike shop in town has said that he is willing to be the hub for any kind of coordination that we need, including petitions. So we're really excited, and we think that hopefully will be on the pathway to get some enhanced bike paths in place in the future. Anybody that's interested in volunteering, please let us know. There's sign-up sheets up front. Then, as usual, we're always interested in new members or renewal members, so membership forms are up front. We also are always interested in topics that you might like us to bring up, so there's forms to fill out if you'd like to suggest any topics for future discussions at our membership meetings. Then, we always like to remind you, it's going to come up closer than we ever think, that on September 8th we have our annual fundraiser. It's our Family Fun Day and Rubber Ducky Race. We've been holding it at a Cowfish restaurant. Correct me, Rebecca, I think it's the 6th year, is that correct? Seventh? Whoops, oh, I'm forgetting. So we have rubber duckies for sale. We need volunteers, so if anyone's interested. Then finally, Rebecca, our treasurer, has the great honor to present our scholarship award to Michael Fasanella, who for multiple years has been just an incredible help to the HBCA. He has just volunteered so much of his time, and he's inspired us to that we're going to evolve our scholarship from where it was usually just an essay contest to where we're going to create an internship at the HBCA. And we really thank you, Michael, for your input. And Rebecca, I'll let you take over.
Yes, okay. Well, let me introduce Michael Fasanella. Several years ago, he started helping us. We had our first St. Patrick's Day parade participation because of his help. Not only has he spent hours of his own, but he's persuaded his friends not only to help us at Ducky Day, to prance as Ducky dancers, and to be invaluable in all our endeavors. And behind the scenes, collecting tables, putting up tents, breaking down tents in the middle of rainstorms, and so on. He has just been invaluable and a true inspiration, and we're glad that we have something that we can offer him. And in the future, if we can get young people to participate, as Michael and his friends have done, it will be an enormous boost both to the community and to our organization. So, Michael, why don't you come up and say hello? This is Michael. And he anticipates heading toward landscape architecture. He has his own firm. My joke is that when he's a multimillionaire by 22, he can give a large donation to the Civic. So, introduce yourself. And
Yeah,
just
thank
say-
you. Thank you to everybody on the Civic Association. It really means a lot. As Rebecca said, I'm looking to go to school for horticulture and landscape design, and I've been doing landscaping for a little while. So I want to do like ecological work and hopefully help out my community a lot. So this scholarship will really help me further myself with my education. So I really appreciate the opportunity for that, and thank you to everyone on the Civic Association for always helping me out and having my back.
Let me give
Thank
you
you.
that. Okay. And this is the important part.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, yeah, let's get this.
With you. Oh, no, I
Rebecca,
Let's specialize on the important
come on,
person.
come on, you stand up here too.
Thank you, Val.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, you've
Thank
definitely been a cheer to us.
Alrighty, then just before we launch into hopefully an animated discussion, I just want to mention we welcome questions, but could you come up to the mic since we're being televised so that we can have you in full view? Please, if you can, pose it as a question, if at all possible. And then we'll start off the discussion. What John and I had been speaking with a little bit about was that we all are aware that it's a community-wide, spanning towns issue now with the waters, and even though we know that there are a lot of programs in place to mitigate them, it seems at the same time that there has been still such an increase, whether it's surface waters contaminated by algae blooms or our concerns about the drinking water and what's going on with the aquifer. So what I was hoping that each of our panelists could do is sort of talk about their major concerns, what they see as the major concern going on right now, what projects are in place to mitigate it, what is on their future horizon, and perhaps their wish list, what they'd like to see done. So John, if I could ask you to start off.
Sure. Well, my time right now is being consumed a lot by our CPF Water Quality Fund. This is a 2% tax that's levied on real estate transactions for purchases. And that money goes into a fund that administers land preservation, which includes water recharge areas and things like that. But 20% of that money has been given over for us to put in and try to mitigate a lot of the nitrogen issues that we have. This is largely from septic systems, but we also just, next to me is Janice Shearer, who's the force behind what we do. And we've just recently opened up our first round of applications for infrastructure projects, and those can be a whole myriad of different things. It can be managing surface runoff. So if we look at the sources of nitrogen, and let's just talk about nitrogen right now, and I got a list of other things that we're doing, but this is my major effort right now. We have we have introduced legislation which allows people in the 0 to 2 travel zone. So that's mainly coastal areas. So people with septic systems are able to get a rebate from the town and from the county, at least from our town as a rebate, and then from the county an additional grant and financing to help replace those systems. And that's going fairly successfully. We're going to expand that law very soon to include cesspools and other things. We're talking about that right now as a group. When I first started this, and what I really wanted to do was to have a water quality board, which is similar to what the CPF fund does with land management. They have a board that advises the town board. They recommend certain purchases and acquisitions under the CPF law. Well, I wanted to establish something very similar to that, a water quality board, but it's a more complex subject, water management. And so I felt it was really important that we have it science-based and fact-based, and that we have people on that board that are vetted in not having financial conflicts and so forth. My biggest hope was that in the future, when I'm no longer on the board, that the next boards that come will be able to avail themselves of a board that is independent and advising them and giving them good science and fact-based advice for how to manage a lot of these issues. So when we talk about infrastructure changes, we're talking about catchments and sediment control, and I know we're going to have a discussion, and a lot of this could come out in conversation. It's difficult sometimes to know what the level of understanding about what we're doing, so I'm going to assume that that you have a kind of a basic idea of what we're trying to do, but there's a lot of detail to this. So I felt that was really important, and it's been pretty successful. And under Janice and Mary Wilson is the program director for the CPF, and they put together a really good group of people, hydrologists and engineer and biologists and people that look at these problems in an analytical way rather than sort of pet project, because that was one of the original concerns from when Fred Thiel first introduced this legislation, that there would be pet projects. It would be politically run rather than scientifically run. So I'm here to assure you, at least at this point, that it is being run in a very fact-based and science-driven method. That's what I'm working on now. But in addition to that, we have these issues, some of the groundwater issues and drinking water issues that have come up. We can talk about those tonight. We have that, and I'll separate that from the issues of groundwater management and the nitrogen and the nitrates that flow into our bays and the algal blooms that we talk about a lot. So you have to separate that in your minds. There's two ways that chemicals get into the bays and into your groundwater, obviously through septic systems, through rainwater, through atmospheric deposition, through a whole host of mechanisms that get these chemicals. In the case of nitrogen, it's a nutrient. It's, you know, the air you breathe is 80% nitrogen right now, and it's the main fertilizer for most living things. And so that gets into the water, and the problem is having too much of it. And when you have too much of it, the algae feed on that, and you get these big blooms that we're talking about. Some algae are not as good as others. There are really good algae, but there are some algae that produce toxins when they're allowed to grow in great abundance, and that's what affects a lot of our biological systems. So talking to Maria Halt, she had sent me a while ago something which there is good news. And the good news is that in the Chesapeake Watershed Authority, the people there had realized that this problem, they realized it much sooner than we did here. It's a pervasive problem. It's not just relegated to Southampton. It's relegated to the entire eastern coast, most coastlines around the world. And Maria and I share a love of diving, and we've also seen different coastlines all around the world, and I can attest to the fact that you know, you go someplace and you come back 20 years later and you see a huge change, and largely it's because of us and our practices and the technologies that we use to manage our waste. So whether it's plastics or whether it's effluent or whatever it is, we're all contributing things from our modern lives. So we each have a responsibility to manage that. That means putting less fertilizer on your lawn, or in my case, no fertilizer on my lawn. And there's a whole host of things. So almost 65% of the nitrogen that we're getting comes actually from lawn-applied fertilizers. There's some agricultural component to that. There's atmospheric deposition, and then a large amount comes from septic into groundwater, which is a different issue than what we're talking about on surface water. So I want to make those distinctions. And I could really go on, but about Chesapeake Watershed Authority, a problem that was recognized almost 40 years ago, acted on starting about 30 years ago. In the 80s, they've been working towards the goal, doing basically the same remediation programs that we're trying to adopt here. It's a massive regulatory issue. You have the state, you have the county, you have local law, and you have federal law. And trying to integrate those things to make and solve a problem is sometimes a challenge. But I think we're up to it because we have some really great representatives through Bridget Fleming's office and through the state, through the Assembly, through the Senate. We have some really good people that are all focused on this issue. So Chesapeake, they went through this, and they are now having eelgrass that has been restored, is growing. The crab population is up, turbidity, or the particles in the water, you can see through the water. I mean, big changes have happened there. And it gives me great hope that we can achieve that if we continue to work on it with good people like the people we have here. I see Steve Abramson in the audience. We're doing a project there on the coastal ponds as well. We need to establish baselines. We need to take a rigorous scientific approach to solving these problems, which I feel very comfortable that we are, and we can get into the details of that tonight. And I'm sorry I go on, but I'm really passionate about this subject. I think it's solvable. I believe that we can do this, but we need your help too. So thank you.
Ed Warner and Jr. and Scott Horowitz are trustees, so they're also, probably most of you are aware of this, but they're elected trustees separate from the elected council men and women, but they all work together in the concerns for the water, among other issues. So, but they come at it from a slightly different angle. So Ed, perhaps you and Scott could talk a little bit.
Sure. Just touch on some of the stuff that John said about the stuff coming into the bays and watershed, and it's basically the trustees and our jurisdiction, the 26,000 acres of underwater lands, are the recipients of all the poor, property uses around the watershed. Education is paramount, and I hope that that's one of the major proponents of the CPF 20. Educating the public on what they put on their lawns and properties has a direct effect to all of us, the bays and the fisheries. The bays and the ocean and everything are the economic engine that everybody comes to recreate out here, and it's really important that we maintain and establish good water quality. We do that with the DEC. They do routine water samplings on all the shellfish growing areas. One of the biggest challenges is probably how to maintain and to work back all the poor water quality that we've had since the 60s, 70s, 80s, the brown tide, the red tides, PSP, and a few other hosts of the rust tide. And working with Cornell Cooperative Extension and Southampton College and the Governor's Task Force, we're going to be placing millions and millions of shellfish in the bays, and working through that. And basically, we're going to have the water filtered, probably almost as much as it was in Great South Bay back in the 70s, almost probably daily, if not every couple of days, by the shellfish there. So that's one of the mechanisms that we're working through. And then eelgrass planting, as John alluded to, in the Chesapeake. Well, we've had very successful eelgrass plantings in western Shinnecock Bay and eastern Shinnecock Bay. Actually, it's probably one of the best eelgrass crops in New York State. So I feel that we've had a lot of success with working with the colleges, with the college and Cornell. But now there's a pool of money. It's CPF 20, and I really see that being an instrument for the town at large, especially the East End, where we are literally surrounded by water, as a mechanism of funding projects, whether it's be dredging projects for, environmental issues or navigation, but just creating better water circulation throughout all our bays and harbors. I mean, like John, I could keep going on and on and on, but I'm going to hand it off to Scott here so he can say a few words.
Can I ask a quick question before, just both you and Scott, which is, what about the recent closure in the Western Shinnecock?
That's paralytic shellfish poisoning. That's a cold water algae that has cysts in the bottom, and when the water warms up to about 45 or 50 degrees, the cysts actually break loose, and then the algae actually becomes floating around in the bay. And it's a paralytic shellfish poisoning, basically because it can make people very sick, and actually out on the west coast in Alaska, and it can cause death in some people. So it's a very serious algae to take into consideration. We do work with the DEC, setting up monitoring stations in Western Shinnecock Bay, and in working our way to the Poncork Bridge. We set these mussels in the water, and they test them weekly to see the thresholds. Once they hit a certain threshold, I believe it's around 70 parts per million, then they will close the waters within a certain distance as a precautionary measure. This year they closed the bays from Pine Neck Point west to Quannock Bay. This is the area of concern with the highest levels of the algae. Everything east of that is certified for shellfish harvesting and can be eaten by humans. So we take it very serious. With the poor water quality and the shellfish, scoring these counts. But one thing I'd like to say, it's probably been in the water our whole lifetime. Until the college, Stony Brook College really became a entity here and really did a lot of sampling. It was probably 8 or 9 years ago when they really took it to heart to do a lot of sampling throughout the town of Southampton and a lot of other water bodies on the East End. So, like I said, probably the PSP algae was there in some kind of form or another. We don't really know how high it was because we didn't do the test back then. But moving forward, as the science allows it, we're being more and more proactive to test our waters for any harmful algae blooms that happen.
I think that happened also last year, but I think they took the closure all the way to the Poncork Bridge West, so it wasn't such a big closure this year. Other things that have been going on, I don't know if close enough to this here, but we did this, most of the people here at this panel, we took a big step just very recently in using this, or talking about actually implementing some of this 20% of the Community Preservation Fund to help us manage the Mecox area. Mecox Bay is an area that we constantly have water quality problems from all different sources, and it's a huge resource of shellfish and finfish and recreational and commercial activities. And the trustees have been managing that for hundreds of years, and we have been working on a management plan for that area for years. It involves many regulatory authorities, and we're finally getting to the point where we're going to have a good plan adopted, so there's a scientific-based rhyme and reason towards maintaining excellent water quality there and a sustainable funding source. So I think that with folks getting together in a science-based fashion and utilizing that to the best of all of our advantages is going to be a big win-win for the environment. This deal with the New York State bringing in millions and millions of dollars worth of shellfish for sanctuary here is going to be a very good thing. Our township receiving this is a little bit different than other townships because in the other townships, these shellfish are going to be placed in non-certified waters, but in ours, there's a good chunk of it that is going into certified waters. So we had some meetings to kind of get the parameters set on where it would make sense, and we could be successful with that and still maintain a good area for recreational and commercial harvest. And also, because we defend all the resources of the town specifically for the folks that live here, the way the deal is structured coming in from the state is very, very important. So legal has to handle that. So we're protecting everybody's interests here, and we're not opening it up to everybody in the state. The trustees have practices of always having buffers on the permits that we give, and also continuing to enforce our ban in treated lumber so that we don't have additional chemicals bioaccumulating in our marine environment. One thing that I think we need to be more proactive in, and I think we're going to need some more budget in, is dredging. Dredging has become a very big problem for many reasons in our town, and it's causing, you know, all types of environmental problems, and it's causing safety and commerce problems. And there are a certain number of regulatory dredge days because of various different reasons, including spawning fish and birds. But I think that we're really going to have to pay more attention to getting a lot of these creeks that have a lot of decaying organic matter that have shallowed. You've increased the water temperatures in those areas, and I think it's further degrading water quality. And I think that's an area that we really need to do a much better job at. With the nor'easters that we had all winter long, we're battling a lot of these areas that are pretty much getting closed off. And to get budget for that and get those projects actually done, it's becoming almost impossible. We've got a big problem now here in Hampton Bays, in the east cut of the inlet, where you can get from the inlet to the canal, the northern side of those buoys. It's about 4.5 feet of water there. That's more of a commerce issue. But as you get further back into the bays, there is a lot of material that has to get moved out. The problem is spoil sites. You can't just put that spoil anywhere. It has to go to some place to either temporarily dewater or stay permanently. And we've got to start working on ways that we can move that material. And I think we can do a lot better with that. But we're trying, and I think by everybody coming together, working on these problems and working with the community, I think we're going to get somewhere. This group made great progress. The Ponquag Bridge Fishing Pier, which is a habitat for millions of filtering bivalves, was saved as the good efforts of this community and a lot of other elected officials. And I think that penny saved is a penny earned. And I think that, keeping that habitat working for everybody, I think is going to be a great thing as well. And we're all looking forward to the ribbon cutting there, which should happen sooner than later. So I'm going to turn it over to Janice.
If I could just quickly, just to put it in context, the CPF Water Quality Fund that we're talking about is a 2% transfer tax. So what that means is that the fund is worth, is really dependent, the level of funding is really dependent on sales. How many houses are bought and sold. And we're enjoying a good economy, but that doesn't mean that we'll always enjoy a good economy. The fund right now is worth somewhere close to $60 million. The CPF land preservation portion of that has purchased almost 5,000 acres over time. And a lot of that is for water recharge and community preservation, but that translates into a $7 to $10 million fund that's available for water quality. If you start to add up the numbers of all the things that need to be done, that's actually a small amount in comparison to some of the expenditures that would be necessary. So we're looking for creative ways of doing other things as well. And as Scott alluded to, there are other projects that are ongoing, but we're also examining things that were successful. Bellport, the culture of having to close an inlet because it's there, that may not be the right way to go. They've seen some very successful repair of their bay systems because they left that inlet open, and they were able to do that. It doesn't mean that any breach is you just leave it open, but it means you should look at that, and that we are looking at that. That this bay seawater exchange is important to be able to. A lot of the issues with paralytic shellfish disease have absolutely to do with temperature, and these sudden changes in temperature. It's not new. It's happened. It's just the degree that it's happened. It's happened. As many of you recall, you were told never to eat shellfish in a month with R in it. That was like the culture you had to do it because people experienced this before. But it's the level of experience that we're having now that's huge. And Bay Seawater Exchange is something to look at. And we've had some discussions here in the past. We have a working group that I've formed to talk about this with people who are engineers and have the background in tidal gate systems and those sorts of things to understand that as well as the biology. So We're trying to be creative. We certainly support the MECOX study, and we've had conversations about that. The process that we have in place is a process that people will apply. So it's all our municipal divisions, our town divisions, as well as private citizens and other organizations, all have the right to make those applications. But it's the metric, is how do we know we're being successful? That's really the key here. We can have wonderful things, but we need to know that we're actually being successful and that we have a good chance of being successful into the future. So a big part of that, and I think Janice, I'm preempting you a little, but I know she'll be talking about that, is how do we measure success? And that's more difficult than it sounds. So, and she's doing a great job, and I appreciate that. So,
John, can I make one correction? It was the oysters, and you're only supposed to eat the shellfish with the letters with R in them.
Eat.
Eat.
All right,
Not eat.
okay.
You said not eat. You're incorrect.
Well, right now you can't eat it anyway.
Yes, correct. Yes.
From point A to point B.
Thank you, everyone. It's good to be here. You might remember I came here when we were doing the CPF referendum and discussing that plan and how it was going to work. And we've been hard at work trying to create the process behind it so that it does work effectively and it's fair and transparent and all of those things. And so we're finally gaining traction and at the point where we can receive applications for projects. So we're having these like sort of open submission periods where there's, like quarterly, and then we'll rate and stack the projects that we get against one another and score them and make recommendations to the town board, who can then decide on what the priority is for funding. So when I came that previous time and talked about Suffolk County and how they've engaged in doing a sub-watersheds plan, and this is the first time that we're ever really going to know the way the groundwater travels and where it is, what it's doing for sure. So the USGS and the county hired CDM Smith to literally map our sub-watersheds so we understand exactly where the water is flowing. We know to some extent, but we don't know to this extent. And then they're going to be giving our watersheds and surface waters of letter grade based on, so we know what water bodies are impaired based on state's parameters and things like that. But this will allow us to focus our efforts on the ones that are obviously worse off than others. Some of them are not so bad, and some are worse than others, as we know. And we know that from the state's listing, we know that from the trustees, we know that from the baymen who work the waters. So we'll be able to, through that program, focus on the impaired water bodies. But I would note that it's sort of like you can't just treat the symptom and expect it to go away. So it's the same thing as your own health. If you don't feel well, it's probably not what's wrong with you that's really what's wrong with you. You know what I mean? So we have to go back to the source and decide what is wrong here. And that's the way we're living, and we understand that now, that we can't just be putting basically the practice of putting a hole in the ground and directing our sanitary waste straight to the water that we drink. It's just not going to work. We all need to understand that that is got to end. So how do we end that and bring in this new way where these new systems treat the waste on your site? So the sanitary systems denitrify, and then the water goes through and is filtered. So we are trying to work out ways to get this new way of sanitary waste treatment into our culture, into our lives. And that's one of the most important ways to rid ourselves of this nitrogen problem, which is going through the groundwater and traveling to the surface water. And that is causing many of the problems that we're seeing the symptoms of. We're seeing all these degraded waters, shellfish issues from the fact that the natural system can't assimilate this amount of nitrogen. So this is what happens. Or other reasons, it doesn't have enough oxygen, it doesn't have, it's out of balance, it's out of whack, because the inputs we're putting in. So we need to control that practice, the chemicals, the pesticides, all those things. These are things that we are trying to work on as far as water hitting the ground and traveling somewhere. It wants to go from one high to low, basically, right? It wants to go from down the road to the water body, and it picks up particles, and those chemicals attach to the particles as they travel. So what do? We need to put in more infrastructure in terms of catching that water, filtering that water, getting a system in place where we're taking the sediment loads out, so by the time they reach the water body, they're cleaner. And these are the efforts that we're engaged in. And also just controlling land uses to be able to assimilate, be part of the living, functioning whole. So it's not just, bad actors anymore. It's everyone in the future is going to have to account for what they're putting into the system. So we do require a certain amount of rainwater catchment on a site, but in these extreme weather events, it's not even able to hold the amount of, and so you have a lot of runoff. And so this is what we're trying to increase our standards, require more catchment on site, increase our way of dealing with the runoff that is wanting to go down the roadways. Maybe we're looking into sort of doing filters on the catch basin pipe at the end of the pipe, like they make these inserts to filter. That might be something. Permeable reactive barriers or these sort of new technology, which isn't really that new, but it's the idea that we have, and back to nitrogen, and I apologize if I'm back and forth, but there's like a myriad of things, as John alluded to. So we have, in that plan, in the CPF plan that we're talking about, we've designated high priority areas. These are areas where the travel time, if something goes into the ground, it's getting to the surface water in less than 2 years. Then we have stuff that's been traveling through the groundwater for decades, and it's going very slowly. So we have two different things. The stuff that's going really fast, how do we stop that from getting there, and then ameliorate the issue that's causing it? So a PRB is a good way to sort of provide a stopgap measure when we know we have a high concentration in the groundwater. It's a sort of a trench. This is one of the methods, but it's a trench where they put a type of medium, which is usually wood chips or something that would grow bacteria. As the nitrogen moves through the wood chips, it uses the nitrogen to grow the bacteria, so it's using it up, and then the water that goes through is not having nitrogen in it. So this is one way to stop nitrogen and utilize it, keep it locked up, while then behind that barrier we're working on getting rid of these old cesspools, getting these new systems installed. So this is another example, and they're doing a couple of sort of pilot ones, one at Iron Point you might have heard of, and one as part of the development proposal at CPI. But it will, before it gets to and it will treat all this nitrogen coming from old sanitary systems in an older neighborhood. So we're looking, and we have at least 9 monitoring wells that we're looking at the effectiveness of how this works, so that we can put this method in place in other places where it makes sense. So those are just 2 small things, but there's a lot, and we want to focus our efforts while we still have these ongoing programs for rebates and things like that to get everybody into a new phase of life. And so, that's awareness, like you said, education and awareness is the key. And so I'm happy to be a part of that. Thank you.
All right, thanks for having us here today, guys. My name's Ross with Legislator Bridget Fleming. There are a couple updates from the county level that you wanted me to share with you guys today. Number one is the recent Article 6 working group revisions. These were some of the first revisions to the sanitary code here in Suffolk County in over 30 years, and Legislator Fleming was very excited to be a driving force in those working group meetings, and that helped lead to 5 different systems that are approved for provisional use by the Suffolk County Department of Health right now. And these are IA systems, innovative alternative treatment systems that you can install right in your home, right in your property to replace a cesspool or septic tank that will do just that what Janice was speaking to, help remove the nitrogen before it even reaches our water table. So like I said, right now there are 5 systems that are approved for provisional use. Currently, the average residential septic system discharges approximately 40 pounds of nitrogen per year. And that being said, it was identified by the county as a primary way to help combat the nitrogen overload that we do see in our water table. The county's also very happy to have been able to work out a grant and low interest financing program. So homeowners who do decide to replace their cesspools or septic tanks with new technologies are eligible for a grant of up to $11,000 to offset the cost of the new systems. And in addition, homeowners can qualify to finance the remaining cost of the systems over 15 years at a 3% fixed interest rate. If anybody is interested in getting some more specifics on that afterwards, come up to me and I'll get you my information. You can also do a quick Google search for Suffolk County Reclaim Our Water, and a lot of the information is available online there. These systems are very important to a geographical area such as Hampton Bays. Not only do you guys have environmental but geographical characteristics that place you at a susceptible place for groundwater issues. That being said, these IA systems are just another way to, and the financing that goes with them are another way to help bring the most affordable, most cost-effective manner to treat our wastewater before, allowing it to go back into our groundwater. And that being said, along with education as to the outside causes aside from wastewater, such as lawn fertilizers that were spoke about early, are really two great ways that we can address the issue and help reduce the overall nitrogen load. Just a few other things. That we have that we're very, very excited about doing recently at the county is transferring the Suffolk County, the Shinnecock Commercial Fishing Dock, which is we recently authorized the conveyance of the dock to the town to allow it for a more local control by the town and input from the fishing industry as well as the town of Southampton to maintain that canal and fishing dock. We were also excited about fighting to get funding put back in next year's budget to repair the jetties and the bulkheads in the canal. So again, if you guys have any questions on any of that, or on those low interest on the low interest grants and financing availabilities for those IA systems, come see me at the end, and I'd love to get you some information.
So while we're on that subject, just to describe our rebate system in the town, we took the tack that we did not want to burden our residents with an expense of that nature, so we made it income-based. So we offer $15,000 up to $300,000 of income, and then it's on a sliding scale up to $500,000 of income, and then after that we figured that anybody who's earning over $500,000 a year could probably pay for it themselves, and I believe they certainly should. So that's what we're doing with our rebate program. But I did want to say one thing about nitrogen in particular, that not how do I say this delicately? Not every family produces as high a grade of nitrogen as some other families, and so you'll note that we talk about reduction in terms of percent reduction. At least that's how I like to look at it, because you'll hear the IA systems are published with numbers like, well, it's going to be 19 milligrams per liter, and that's the goal that's set forth. But in fact, we're talking about percent reduction. So these systems are reducing by percentage about 65% of the waste of a standard septic ring system. Of course, depending on what goes in. Some families are larger contributors. In fact, online we have a little calculator there that can sort of give you an idea of what your nitrogen footprint might be. But that's important to know, that sort of a published standard of a technology, its real goal and our real goal, and the way we want to measure it, is by how much we're reducing the nitrogen contribution in these systems. And I just wanted to make that point, that we're looking at that. And some systems, cesspools as an example, contribute a lot more than the standard ring systems with leaching tanks, and IA systems certainly are less than that. And I fully expect this technology over time. And it's one of the reasons we rolled this out slowly, is that we wanted to be sure that the system worked. This is the first time this town has done anything like this, and we were very careful about how we rolled this project out, this program out. And I think it's running very successfully. I'd like to see a lot more septic systems installed, and the incentive is that, you know, at this point in the history of this program, you have the opportunity to do that right now. And I would encourage those people in the 0 to 2, and there is potentially, you may be potentially eligible for that even outside of those areas, depending on how the funding, what its levels are right now. So we're kind of in talks about trying to do that. But right now we're looking at the 0 to 2 because that's the highest contributory areas of the town of Southampton.
Thank you. Would anybody like to ask a question? Could you come up to the mic?
Hi, I'm Gloria Burke, and I'm co-chair of the Southampton Town Sustainability Committee. And I'd like for probably John and Janice, it's last name Shearer, what's her first name? To talk a little bit about collection systems that are not for an individual house, but for a group of houses, because as you alluded to, John, the technology is changing. And so if you've got these relatively expensive new systems in place, to upgrade them is going to be more money, where if you can have a group of houses with a collection system, it'll be easier to upgrade that. And I know there's some work at the town level. I thought you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, there is. I mean, for the water quality portion, we're actually purchasing land where we have higher density areas, because certainly it doesn't make sense in a small dense area of, say, 200 homes. It doesn't make any sense to simply replace each of those at that cost when we can put in a cluster system, and by cluster system I mean a system that's tailored to serve a certain amount of houses. If you start talking about sewage districts, in my mind, it's just a different kind of jargon, is that usually those are designed, and this is where, unfortunately, my engineering background comes into play. You over-design things, and you can promote density. So the cluster systems are designed specifically for those areas, and we've been working with the county, and certainly with Bridget Fleming's office and Peter Scully and the whole group there to develop that. But we are in the process of purchasing some of those areas, and the idea would be that if you're a community and you have a homeowners association, and there's lots of ways to do that. You could tax yourselves, you can contribute to that, and you could share that cost burden. It would be a lot less to the community as a whole rather than the individuals in that. And I know Janice would want to add something to that.
Well, as I mentioned, we're accepting applications right now, and one of the eligible type of proposals could be a homeowners association could get together and say, hey, we've got a group here, and we can, you know, do something, and we can work with you to find a piece of property in your location and just retrofit one parcel, and then if there's some upgrade, it's so much easier to fix that than individual systems, like Lorian said. But either way, we'll do whatever we have to tackle it from every possible perspective. So if it's a group of homes that want to get together as a homeowners association, or mobile home park, or anything like that, we can work with you. Or if you're just, you know, a single family, you know, and you want to do the IA system, that can work as well. So either way, we're looking at every available option. No stone unturned, nothing is off the table. We'll try to make it work for 5 houses or 200 homes. It doesn't matter.
Thank you, Janice. Did you want to?
Yes. I'm Ray D'Angelo from Hampton Bays. And my question really is how code enforcement is related to this problem. We have several issues here in Hampton Bays. We have single-family houses that now have become rooming houses, where you normally have a family of maybe 5 to 7 people. We have like 17, 18 people living there. We have the motel crisis, which the town has been impotent to even recognize or do anything about. And really, my question is directed really at Mr. Bouvier. Being at the collapse of, we're seeing the collapse of code enforcement, don't you think this has an effect on the amount of nitrogen that migrates down into the bays? I mean, like, this migration maybe started 4 or 5 years ago, and it was really the height of the housing crisis here in Hampton Bays, the illegal housing crisis. And we still don't have good code enforcement. We still have the motel crisis. And I spoke to you guys not too long ago. We haven't done anything since then. I think 2 months ago down at the Ponquag Firehouse about the safety issues involved here. And now it's really apparent that it's an environmental issue. And I would just think that you would be interested in prevention. I mean, these systems, first of all, are very expensive. There's a yearly fee that you need. And at the same time, you want people not to put fertilizer on their lawn. And now you have houses that, you know, when I walk my dog, I see 8, 9 cars on the lawns. We still have that in Hampton Bays. And you probably have 18, 17 people living in individual rooms. And they probably, with these antiquated septic systems, which are overloaded. I do know, for example, getting back to the motels, you can see actual seepage from the Bel Air Motel in the parking lot, which goes right into I don't know what body of water that is right there, but eventually ends up in Tiana Bay where we had the algae bloom. So my question really is, do you guys see a relationship, or that doesn't matter to you? I mean, you think it's more important that we not put fertilizer on the lawn and let these rooming houses proliferate in the town, or do we should strengthen our code enforcement? Thank you very much.
Well, I don't want to conflate the two issues, but certainly they're related in some ways, perhaps not the way that you describe. I happen to think that our code enforcement, we've stepped it up quite strongly, and we're continuing to work on that. People have constitutional rights. You just can't throw people out on the street, but we're working hard with there are some things that I can't discuss right now relative to some of the motels that you're alluding to. There's also older systems that were originally put in place, which were vaulted systems. It was a standard of septic control that was used, and basically it was a tank, and the tanks required to be emptied all the time. And so when you had a lot of use, particularly in high summer times, particularly with hotels and motels, that was the sort of the standard of the septic system. So I don't agree with your characterization that that code enforcement has collapsed. I think we've hired Stephen Troy, who I think is doing an excellent job, and we're working with him, and I think he's doing that. These things are certainly probably taking longer than anybody would like, because we have to go through courts relative to this all the time, and we're constantly in court about trying to make those corrections. So if I derive your question somehow that they're related, yeah, of course they're related. Any house is related. If you have a party in a house, people are going to flush toilets a lot, and certainly that's related to the occupancy of a particular place. There are laws that are in place that I think are enforced. Quite often it's very hard to enforce laws of that nature when it's so pervasive. But I have a lot of confidence in our Director of Code Enforcement that these problems are being addressed, and I certainly support what they're doing. And there are some things that I can't discuss relative to litigation, but I can assure you that it's not being ignored, it's not being dismissed, and it certainly is a part of our thinking process.
I have to respectfully disagree with you. We've had this motel problem going on
Well,
here.
sir, I came here to talk about water quality, and I'm happy to offline
Well, I just
discuss it
wanna-
with you. I don't want to take up people's
Well, I just
time.
want to have a little retort here, that this is going on. We haven't moved this 1 millimeter, and you know that, and I know that.
No, I don't know that, and I would be happy to talk with you offline.
Well, I disagree with you. We haven't moved it
we have-
1
we have to
millimeter. There's
agree
not
to
one
disagree.
motel that's been taken care of.
Ray, why don't you just continue after the meeting with John about that, all right? Thank you. All right. I had a question for Janice. You were talking about the mapping that is being developed. Will that be mapping the plumes that there's a lot of concern about in the different areas too, or is that like with my lack of scientific knowledge, is that more focused on a certain type of underwater subject?
I'm not sure that they're really mapping plumes per se, although the DEC is aware of the Spionk plume and its movement, although its origin is still not known. The mapping I'm talking about is just, it's sort of like the veins of our
Yeah, the groundwater flow.
well, yeah, how the groundwater works, you know, and the
Because
the
I
river
think,
system, you know, like the way, like, say, the Peconic River flows,
Mm-hmm.
or, you know, and how those tributaries and waters work in a watershed from the point where the rain hits the ground to, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and the groundwater is the water table. So that whole, like, hydrological regime will be better understood by understanding the subwatershed, the subsurface flow
Yeah.
of the water.
and,
If I could, so if we envision the groundwater under us, it's not just a bathtub with water under it. It's got different geology. So some of it's clay, some of it's sand, some of it's all sorts of different things. And so the water, we have a divide basically. So water flows north on one side of the divide and flows south on the other side of the divide. And to map that is difficult, but it's kind of, if you start to look at it from that standpoint, water doesn't always go the way you think it does. You know, we had certain expectations that water flow, watersheds in particular, would go in one direction. In the largest sense, they do, but on a local level, if you put your resolution down to smaller and look at it in a smaller direction, some of that water is doing odd things. Sometimes it goes laterally, sometimes it goes into different places, and that's important for us to know for a lot of obvious reasons, and certainly I'm looking forward to seeing this study. It's supposed to be out next month. There have been pieces of it that have already been revealed, but they put a lot of work into that, and it's absolutely critical to the installation of the systems that we're talking about.
oh, I think we'll all be very interested in seeing the results. I think, too, also, I think some people may not realize that, and my understanding is rudimentary at best also, that the groundwater flows at, I forgot what the rate is per foot, but you have some water that's hitting the bays that has been flowing for a decade or more, right? And so that we actually are feeling the impact in the bays of water that may have been started off from some home or some building like 10, 20 years ago. And then some is only from, more recently near the coast, right? And I think there's a big disparity there. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's what, actually, I was just recently at a meeting with USGS where they were talking about estimating that amount of nitrogen, the legacy nitrogen that's still moving through the system to get an understanding of what we're dealing with from the past.
Mm-hmm.
So we can understand the stuff that's flushing in and flushing out quickly, and we can try to put a stopgap measure there, but the water that's traveling from decades or, longer, we have to understand, like, well, what were the inputs back then? Because it was less density, but there was more agriculture, let's say, or there was more, whatever the uses were.
Cruder
and so
systems,
they're
yeah.
trying to understand that from a land use perspective from the point of 1850 when the railroad really came in and on. So that's what actually people are thinking about, like, what were the inputs and what can we expect that, based on all these land uses that have changed over time.
And I think land use is one of the big issues right now that big question in a lot of people's mind is, should the land use planning be more focused on the impact on water and not just septic systems, but overall land use planning?
Well, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I am a wholehearted believer in taking a systems approach toward everything. And so you can't look at anything in isolation when you're dealing with ecology or life in general. So I think you have to look at everything you can to get a big picture and then focus down. But that's what the Sustainability Committee also is really engaged in, is trying to put seemingly disparate things together and understanding them from a bigger picture.
So it's interesting because we also have the issue of sea level rise. So we're seeing more saltwater intrusion into our freshwater sources along the coast, and that's going to be a continuing problem over time. And how do we deal with that? So I sit on the Sandy task force, review task force, which is a task force that was created by the county to look at the lessons that we learned in Sandy, and certainly we learned or we didn't learn a lot of the administrative lessons about that, but we're in the process of trying to give a better set of recommendations on how we protect our coastlines, whether that's infrastructure or other, but a big part of that component is water management, obviously, but the saltwater intrusion and the way water flows back to the coast, and that has a lot to do with, you know, when you think of a storm, it's not just the storm and its debris that you worry about, but it's also the chemicals that get discharged because of storm events, whether it's oil tanks or other, you know, things in people's garages. You know, I cleaned out a garage that my father had from the 50s, and I'm finding little canisters marked with the skull and crossbones. I have no idea. But if that got into the water in large amounts, that's an issue to really consider. And so we're talking about monitoring, and I know that Ed and Scott have talked a lot about monitoring, which I think is critical in that sense, not just for the reason of knowing what's going on, but also so that we can be responsive in storm management. It's a big recommendation that we're probably going to make. That report should be out hopefully in August. So.
We'll look forward to it. Do you think that there needs to be more money in monitoring, whether it's coastline or another big issue is drinking water? You know, everybody's concerned, and it's a hot topic right now about, you know, contamination of wells, and do we need more monitoring? Should there be more money in monitoring on the county level for, you know, not only monitoring, but, you know, putting remediation into effect?
I think we're very fortunate that we have the Peconic Estuary Program. It's a sort of a conglomerate of federal, state, and county efforts, and scientists and engineers and people who do that. And the simple answer is yes, absolutely. In real time, that's what we want to recommend, is that you have real time. We have the technologies now that we can get real time information rather than having to go and take that sample when it might not be possible to do. So yeah, I would envision a coastal monitoring system that would allow us to get some of that important information, particularly as it pertains to storm events, but also as it pertains to quality of water.
Hi, Janice. Hi. Hi, my name is James Ding, and I'm from Southampton. And I have a couple of issues, one with misinformation, and that is nitrogen is an element. And you cannot take nitrogen out of anything. You can combine it with something to change it. And with the new septic systems, the one that has the irrigation field where the wastewater is pumped up to the surface and it combines with the air, oxygen, it creates another, I don't want to say element, but a combination. And this new system, as this gentleman alluded to, is that it has to be pumped once a year at a cost of $500. And the system is a $15,000 system. Now, I understand that we have destroyed our water systems. But my question is, why are we not changing our schools, hospitals, government buildings, septic systems right now before we do each and every one of our homes? This is where people congregate, and either they come in here, use the toilet, or they leave before and use the toilet. You're talking, you know, in Southampton School District, there is 1,620 students. I'm not sure, I'm not from Hampton Bays, but 2,040. You have, you know, these are where mass amounts of people, little ones, yes, but they are generating urine. Why aren't we doing this first?
We are.
That's the quick answer. So and I apologize that I didn't mention this up front. The first thing we did was get a list of all town facilities and determine which ones we can activate first. We sent a letter to every school district and every high flusher there is, the hospital, everyone. So we said, you are eligible as a project. We will work with you with our CPF fund. And we can't walk in with a bulldozer and create and replace a school district's sanitary system, but we can partner with them and we can offer them money to do it. So we've talked to a couple school districts. We are all over it. We want to do that first.
Has there been any implementation?
Town hall.
Tell me
yes,
me one.
So, first of all, the program just started. So everybody with the implementation, we're trying to get there in a way that makes sense. We're not just willy-nilly all over the place. So we're starting out, like I said, all town facilities. We assess them. What's on the docket that would make sense first? Southampton Town Hall will be first. They've done Mashut Beach already as a county facility, which Ross can talk about. We are working, that's an IA system. We will be doing a STP system in Town Hall. The facilities like this, the Bridgehampton Nutrition Center, all of them, we're actively prioritizing them. You know, it's not just walk in and do it. You have to like mobilize it. You have to get it onto a capital project list. You know, so we 100% agree with you, and we know this. We are working toward it, and you know, nothing happens on day one. But yes, the first one will be Southampton Town Hall as the largest.
And when will we see that done?
I think it's on the capital project list for next year.
And will the monies from the CPF solely be used for that, or are you going to try to get monies from
No.
other?
No. No, it's part of the 20% money. So the town has to compete against everything too. So the town is putting forward its projects. The trustees are putting forward their projects. And we group the projects in a orderly fashion so that each quarter we understand, because the town board doesn't want to say, well, I'm not sure if I want to fund this because I don't know what's coming up next. So we've asked everybody to itemize and have an intended use plan so we can prioritize and account for it as it goes forward. Because the town board doesn't want to say, great, let's spend $2 million here, and then suddenly another project comes up that's even better or worse. So they want to know what's online for the horizon. So this was a system that we can do that most accurately we can understand what's coming online, what, you know, the villages, the town, everybody has a lot of facilities. So they have to prioritize their own facilities, just as we're doing with our facilities director. Decide what makes sense to prioritize it, apply for the funding, and get scored and rated, and the town board makes a decision. So this is how it works.
So just to add to that, also the villages, the incorporated villages have been notified. As an example, West Hampton Beach has they want to be hooked up to the Gabreski sewage district system up there. Part of the CPF fund could be available to them to help them do that. But let me put this in context. As I alluded to originally, we have between $7 and $10 million on a given year to be able to use, and we have to prioritize that in a way that makes the most sense, the most important projects, what we can do best. If put that in context with a sewage district system, which can cost upwards of $16 to $17 million. So one sewage district can completely wipe that out. So we have to have a priority, and many of these projects are not just like 1 year. It's not like we just buy a piece of property like we would do with the Community Preservation Fund. These need to be engineered, and they go over long periods of time, 2 to 3 years. That's part of that. So we've directed to lead by example, and I think that's what you're alluding to. The town itself wants to lead by example, so we're doing that. We've made those offers to all our departments. We've all our buildings. We're reviewing everything now. That how do we switch over? But clearly, if we did that as a town, in one session, we would exhaust the fund in 1 year. So we have to be very careful how we implement. So it's not just when are we going to implement, it's how we're going to implement.
Yes, but John, when you're saying that you can wipe out your system in 1 year, you're a heavy polluter. as well. So all those years that don't get, and this should be mandated. It's not where you're coming up with these roadblocks and creating piles of paper here, piles of paper there, and piles of paper here, and then all of a sudden you say, oh well, we got one on the list. You just told me you have Southampton Town as the first one.
Well, that's the one most ready to go. We have to prioritize what's ready. So we have to do it in order. And we're trying to work with the school that we're adjacent to do it at the same time. So it would be 2 for 1 in that case. So we get that. I don't disagree with you. We are working on it. The sense is that we don't understand this or we're not doing that. But I can assure you we are.
I think you actually are both on the same page. All right, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, John.
And I just also wanted one thing about nitrogen. Certainly N is an element, but we're talking about nitrates and nitrites and different forms of nitrogen, and the process of that's quite often used, the natural process, is a conversion of nitrates to gaseous nitrogen, which you're breathing right now. That's the fundamental biological process that everything that consumes nitrogen uses. As you know, some plants fix nitrogen and others don't. So one of the issues about fertilizing people's lawns is that quite often turf grass does not fix nitrogen. It has to be fed, and it gets overfed, and it's the overfeeding that causes this runoff into the water, which is one of the problems that we're dealing with. So I just want to make a clarification on what nitrogen, what we mean when we're talking about nitrogen. Quite often we juxtapose those terms and we say nitrogen, but really what we're talking about is nitrates.
Hi, John Capone from Hampton Bays. I just have 2 quick questions. You may have mentioned this one already, but where is the 0 to 2 year map available to the public?
You can look on our CPF plan. In the plan, shows all the high, medium priority areas are the 0 to 2 travel times.
Okay.
And there's also the list of all the other reasons why we call them high priority, which have to do with whether or not they have cesspools, if they're the FEMA flood zones. There's like several other parameters that made them high priority. But the 0 to 2 year travel time is there.
Is that on the website or?
Yep.
Yeah,
it's on the town's website.
It's a great website. It's really worth checking out. There's a lot of information there, and if you have any trouble with it, contact my office or Janice, and we're happy to guide you through. But hopefully, it's usable to the residents, and they have been. We've gotten a lot of hits on it. So
and the rebate application form is there, and the project application form is there. So either way.
My other question might be a little bit off topic, but it is related to water quality and water use. I'm just curious if the trustees or the town board has an opinion or has taken an official position on offshore drilling and offshore wind farms.
I could tell you on the offshore drilling, I actually did show up as, I think, the only elected official in the town of Southampton to testify against offshore oil drilling. I did that at the Brookhaven Town Hall in the middle of one of the nor'easters, and I did speak for my full 3 minutes, is all I got, to basically say that I felt it to be a completely irresponsible plan. And we're battling water quality, as we all know, from the inside, and we certainly couldn't deal with battling it from the outside. And so on that, I thought that I had to make a statement for the trustees, because it's too much. We couldn't handle that. If you want to talk.
Yeah, I think it's a really bad idea, offshore drilling, just because the potential for a oil spill. I mean, we have the most beautiful, pristine beaches in the world here, and the last thing we need is a Deepwater Horizon or something like that, where it would cripple our economy practically maybe for tens of years and maybe longer. And just one spill could, wipe out, all the shellfish and all the fish and everything that we hold so dear. But, it's another thing is there's no infrastructure here for, the drilling rigs and stuff like that. So it would be really impractical for them to set that up. The wind farms, I think the wind farms are a good idea, but they need to really take in consideration the commercial fishing industry, and there's, there are other user groups besides the wind farms out there, the commercial recreational fishing, and I know there's been some issues with the wind farms in the North Sea. I don't believe it's been fully resolved yet, so I think a little bit more research and some more conversations should be had before it's, fully, permitted.
So back in August of last year, the town board introduced a resolution, a memorialized resolution to support, to go against offshore drilling and exploration, largely for a lot of the reasons that both Ed and Scott had alluded to. But certainly our economy is highly dependent on that. There are 44 companies that have formed a consortium that are pushing hard to drill less than 2 miles off our coastline. It's an outrageous thing, and I'm vehemently opposed to it. I had worked as a commercial diver in the Gulf of Mexico for the oil and gas industry in my youth in another life, and I can tell you from firsthand experience that I have seen things and practices that are done where we could be into a really serious impact to our economy and certainly our environment. So I'm absolutely opposed to it. I think our residents should be made more aware that this is being contemplated, that they're opening up the northern fields. It's not just oil, it's also gas, which brings with it seismic profiling and as a different kind of drilling. How that's going to get landed, I have no idea. So we were so opposed to it, the full board signed off on it and agreed to it. And I know Scott was able to get to, we'd gotten about a 4-hour notice for a meeting about this, so I'm glad Scott could get there, because none of us could, and it's an outrageous thing. As far as wind power, I'm a strong proponent of wind power for a couple of reasons. One is I'm a strong proponent of alternative energy. Obviously, we have set a goal in the town of Southampton to be energy independent by 2025. A big part of that is wind. But there are stakeholders that can be impacted by offshore wind, and they need to be heard, and adjustments need to be made to make sure that all stakeholders can survive and thrive. And Ed alluded to commercial fishing, but there's also other industries as well that could be touched. It's more sometimes, and I know that like groups of fishermen have worked with trying to find areas so that trawlers can still trawl and fishermen can still fish, and trying to do that is not as easy as it sounds. There are a little bit of the issue of where you land that power. Is critical. I know that East Hampton, they've been fighting that as well. How do you land that? Where do you land that? And how does that work? Whether there are environmental impacts, particularly in the transmission rates. I learned something the other day that I didn't know, that they're actually converting to AC power rather than DC, which has certainly a lower electrical signal than on the DC side. It's a better power transmission system, but I think that it's the future, I think, but we should do that with all our residents and our stakeholders and businesses that thrive on this economy in mind.
Thank you.
John.
And speaking about offshore drilling, Legislator Fleming was also very proud to be able to speak at that same public hearing, and even authored a letter that garnered signatures of other county legislators that was sent to the Department of Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke within a week after Florida was removed from the list for the reasons that were stated as tourism as an economic driver and the detrimental effects that offshore drilling could have on that sector. Obviously, us being a coastal community, tourism is an economic driver, certainly here on Long Island as well. So we were very, very proud to be able to urge the Secretary of the Interior to remove us and this whole region from any proposed offshore drilling in the future.
Okay, Maria Holtz from Hampton Bays. I'm familiar with what's underwater. I'm not as familiar with the septic systems, but I have two questions. Number one, you said that the PEP is doing so well in monitoring, what are we going to do when the legislature that our current president has put in that's going to not offer them funding? How is that going to help?
You had two questions you want to?
Let's do that one first, because
Well, it is an issue. You know, what the EPA does, a lot of funding comes through the EPA, and it was actually leveled by the federal government. The Conneaut Estuary program, Conneaut Estuary, was formed on that, with the idea to preserve and protect our coastlands, our wetlands, and important ecological areas. So I happen to sit with someone who works with the EPA, and you know, we have this discussion. The answer is I don't have an answer. The answer is we have to deal with what happens somehow. The EPA has been gutted on several levels, particularly at the local level, where we don't have slots filled right now. Without organizations like the EPA that bring together scientists and people of like mind to try to preserve the very reason we all live here. The coastlines and what we see underwater, equally part of what you see on the surface. That's important. We do regularly correspond, and we do work with other governments, other parts of our federal government to preserve that. Hopefully that won't go away. I think it's a really critical issue, but you know, I can't say that. Can I say I'm optimistic? I think wise minds prevail ultimately. That these are very, very important things, particularly to our coastlines and our coastal communities.
thank you. And the next question is, I was at the State of the Bays address at Southampton College, and there was a discussion on, number one, that some of the septic systems that have been approved are not functioning at nearly the level they were purported to be functioning at, and therefore, I guess, weren't considered that great. And number two, that there's a new system that's being tested that hopefully will be approved, which in my simplistic language I could only describe as a PRB with a pump for house use, you know, for individual houses, which seemed fairly reasonable if the PRB actually does work and affordable. So is this something that's going to be covered under the town or the county if it is approved? And if the PRBs are working, are you using them in filtration any other way than with CPI? You know, some of these wells and houses in our water system, the wells that are closed. I'm not sure how many questions that was.
Well, we got a lot of answers.
Anything that is approved by Suffolk County will be eligible for us. So the county retains its right as the ultimate authority on all of these systems, and so we defer to them on that. So if it's a system that becomes approved for use, then it's eligible for our rebate. If it's, and I think they have this like general rule of like 10-10-30,
Yeah.
which is it has to be under 10,000. What was the other 10?
You put me on the spot.
Cost under
Cost
10,000,
under.
something another 10, and last 30. You know, last 10 years, and
Not over 100.
it was this sort of mantra that they, you know, that their R&D type of, where they want it to be an affordable system that lasts for 30 years and another 10. 10 milligrams, thank you.
That was
All
it.
right, Andrea. Get
Right.
under 10 milligrams per liter of
liter.
nitrogen, under 10,000, and lasts for 30 years. And
Well,
that's
I know
kind
it
of
was
the paradigm they're working under.
It was purported to be 10,000 or under. It, you know, who
Right.
knows what it's going to come in as.
Right.
I find it interesting that, you know, the way we used to deal with waste was dig a hole and put a little shed over it, and that's pretty much how, and we use the natural systems to mitigate nitrogen. That wasn't the intent, but it was about the smell and other things. But I'm all for any new technologies that can help us resolve that. And as I alluded to earlier on, that I fully expect new systems to come down the pike as time goes by. The 10 milligram per liter is actually what's set as the maximum safe limit in drinking water. And we want that to be less than 10 milligrams per liter. In
Not
fact,
for
most
fish,
countries, most countries are, well below that by half.
Yeah.
So, that gets back to your issue about the EPA. Well, yeah, the EPA's been petitioned over many administrations to reduce that number, but they have not. I think any system is good. The PRBs that we have right now are being evaluated for functionality. There were originally PRBs put in Florida. The big question was how long would they last? And that, the 10-10-30, I think, alludes to how long are they going to last, because it's a big deal to dig out this volume of material, and then when you have this volume of material, what do you do with it? How do you dispose of it? Those kinds of things. But I know there's other things coming down, and we also have the systems. It's not just every time I see Steve over here, it reminds me that we have systems that work on nitrogen, but we also have a phosphorus issue. We have other nutrient loading issues. So one of the systems actually is set up with iron to be able to pick up that silt, the phosphorus latent, because the phosphorus sits in silt and binds to it, and that's how we can pick that up. So there are systems, that are headed in that direction. As far as the published results that some of the systems weren't working as expected. Yeah, that's true. I think one system in particular wasn't doing as well as they might have expected. But they also had a test regimen of once a month, and that's a difficult conclusion to draw from month-to-month testing, particularly with the kind of winters and things that we have. So I wait for the 6-month conclusion to see that. One system I do know isn't working up to par, but even up to par is far better than a septic ring system with a leaching field.
And what about the use of filters for the wells? The
Drain fields?
Drain field?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the idea there is that the root zone sort of can utilize that excess nitrogen. So it's not, it's sort of locked up then underneath in that root zone.
I'm sorry, I'm thinking of like what was going on with the firehouse and the chemicals that
Are
were
you
in
talking
the
about
water.
PFOA?
drinking water.
Yeah, those wells,
drinking
yeah.
water.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I wasn't sure what you were talking about.
No, my bad.
Your question is specifically related to carbon filters
Yeah.
for PFAS. They function, and as town board, we are the commissioners of the Hampton Bays Water District in particular, and I think that may be what you're alluding to. We've put in new protocols. There were some mistakes made. I think we've got those corrected. In particular, they're putting in on those wellheads carbon filters, which are functioning at zero detection. They're not online yet, and those wells aren't open yet. And I can afterwards I can share with you. We actually we commissioned a report, an investigative report on what was going on there relative to that, and we discovered that some of the wells didn't have blow-off. So in order to try to measure, you had to open a well and then take a sample and then close it again, and that was some of the issues with PFAS. But if the question is related to do carbon filters work on PFAS, yes, they do quite well. And the next step, of course, is what do you do with the carbon, and how do you dispose of that, and how does that get taken care of? And it sort of alludes to this earlier question you had, at least the way I understood it. We have like fertigation systems where you use natural materials to absorb nutrients or chemicals, and they sequester them. But then you have to take those things and you have to put them someplace, and that's part of what we're trying to understand now is, okay, well, we have these wonderful systems, but how do we dispose of that stuff responsibly? And I think we're all smart enough now or knowledgeable enough now about these processes that we're able to deal with that in an effective way and not simply trade one problem for another.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary Payzan from Hampton Bays. I'm kind of curious, a couple of little things about the 2 grant programs and how, I know it's early, but how robust a response you have received from residents, and whether either the town or the county have any metrics other than, how much nitrogen is in the water, but any metrics or plan to develop any metrics so that it can be determined whether the program is successful.
I don't know, Ross, if you want to respond to that, because we're largely dependent on the program that the county, because it's the health department that approves the residential systems, so we're largely dependent on them. They do have a system of sampling every 6 months, I believe it is, and how they're measuring success on that, I believe that there's
Yeah, I'm just curious to know how many people have responded to date, whether there have been any approvals, installations, reimbursements.
Do you have info on that?
So I do know that the county does track that information. I don't have the most up-to-date numbers on hand. I can get those, to you to be, distributed through the Civic Council. But I do know that the county does keep those metrics.
Yeah, no, that would be great. Just and that kind of goes then to the education question, because you talked, a little bit about getting people to know about things and educating people. And are there any thoughts either going on with the town or the county to publicize these grants more, or to hold like training seminars for people who are interested? I mean, I look at the application and I go, whatever, but seminars that would help people understand it, and otherwise you look at it and it seems like an awful lot of paperwork and help, and so does the town have any plans for that?
Yeah, we talk about that a lot on our advisory committee that John was discussing, but I think the last number I had was either 44.
Yeah, I think it's close to.
It was around 50 approvals for the rebates. 50 systems, 50 different people were, eligible to receive. They're in various stages at the health department. That's
Right,
where the
right.
time goes. So what happens is you come in and you say, "Here's my tax return. Am I eligible?" You say, "Yes, you are." Encumber the money so that you're going to get it. Then
It's
you-
all. Is it reimbursable?
Yes.
So you have to pay up
So
front
you pay up
first.
front, although CDC Long Island and the county have worked out a grant program to bridge that gap so that you can access that funding and get the rebate back. And our turnaround time to return the rebates, is as fast as the warrant. As soon as someone closes out the process, they can be paid 2 weeks later.
Yeah, it would be nice to see just how people are responding to the program.
They've been mostly positive. We've had a really good, and Mary can speak to this better because it's her office that administers the program. Fortunately, she's not here, but her and I talk about it all the time. It's a big deal for people, and they're really proud of it at the end of the line when they put this new
finally-
system in. By the way, that our grant program
The first
also
flush.
reimburses you for the maintenance costs. So, how someone was saying up front, it's a lot of cost, you
Right.
got to pay for the maintenance. Our rebate program actually will give you that money. If you have leftover after you've done your system installation and you show us a contract that says, "Look, I have a contract and it's $500," we'll give you that back. So that will help alleviate that. And the idea is that it's sort of like it has to scale up in order for these things to come down. So these early investors are getting that, the early responders are getting the benefit of the maintenance
And then
included.
with the applications for projects, I'm kind of curious to know who, if people have applied, or are they businesses, or are there any not-for-profits that apply? And I know that there's a lot of information on the application and everything online, but as a hypothetical, I don't know how flexible the language is, but not that we would ever probably do this, but let's suppose the Civic Association sought to get a grant that wouldn't maybe not be used for a project, but would be used for like educational or information purposes related to this whole issue. Is that something that would be entertained, or it's strictly
No.
projects?
It's only project
Capital
related.
projects.
We're bound by state law. So the state law is very specific. It has 5 different definitions of what a water quality project is, and it has to fall into one of those categories.
Right.
So the educational component, although Peconic Estuary Program and Cornell Cooperative have reached out and said, how can we help you with the educational side of your mission? So we're entertaining and speaking to them about how to get the word out as part of the grant. And I call it a grant loosely, but as part of this program, say the town or a village, the early adopters are towns and villages, because they're the most poised to take advantage of it, because they have, these projects already in mind. They already kind of have been thinking of them. So they're coming forward first. So I would say the early people right now are municipal governments.
So
Including
we're
the
at
villages.
we're at a disadvantage here in Hampton Bays.
How so?
Well, if it's, I mean, you're talking about like Southampton Village and the village of this. Well, we're not a village, so.
You don't need to be a village. The town of Southampton is.
I thought when you said the municipalities, you meant the smaller,
I mean
like
us
the
too.
village of Southampton.
No, I'm just saying that we have several villages, incorporated villages.
Right.
We have the town of Southampton. We have school districts. We have a hospital. We have all these different entities that may or may not have projects. Then there's NGOs. There's Cornell Cooperative Extension. There's
So
all.
if if Hampton Bays, and I know we're running out of time, but if Hampton Bays, if we all got together and thought we had a project, how we're not really. I mean, we are the Civic Association, but it
Well,
can not-for-profits
yeah,
apply.
Well, it has to be.
or-
It has to qualify as either wastewater treatment project, a drainage or infrastructure project.
Right,
It
well,
has
if
to
we
have.
could come up with something like that.
Yes, you're more than you're more than welcome to apply. It becomes a town project, so the town board has to vote on it and has to sponsor it and has to fall into one of those categories.
And
So-
would the
so-
town do the contracts as well, or is that?
But the way it would work, you actually have an advantage, in my view, in Hampton Bays, because you have a lot of dense areas that are in the 0 to 2 travel zone, and you have like in the Lobster Inn property, we want to purchase part of that property to be able to put that aside to hook up to those homes there, to get them off of septic and direct contribution and into a cluster system. Where you have homeowners associations, and you can form homeowners associations to do that. So we're talking about a residential system or a cluster system for residences as a small development. So there's nothing to stop you from, as a homeowners association right now, from making that application. And the CPF office will help do that. Well, there's what you need to do. It doesn't have to be engineered. It has to be designed and understood, and then it goes through that process. But I see no reason why that would be a handicap. I think in some ways it would be an advantage.
And it's not, it's not educational. It's literally like a solution to a problem. So if you said, hey, in my neighborhood, the water is flowing and there happens to be this vacant parcel that you can do something to avert the water or deal with the storm water or something to do with, this is just for example, then you can come and say, CPF, can you acquire this parcel with water quality money and do something with the drainage there, and we can evaluate that and recommend it. So that's the idea in term, if it was a parcel or a collective of people that wanted to get together to put a cluster treatment system or things along those lines. It has to meet those
But
steps.
I'll just add too, Mary, that the trustees we work with the trustees on the SPAT program, administered with Cornell, and those kinds of programs. Those are educational programs as well as a component of that. And part of that education is to restore our shellfish beds, which is one of the foundations of our ecosystems in the water and marine systems. So we educate people as a part of that program. Now, whether that would be eligible or not, it would have to have at its basis the water quality. But part of what CPF will fund is agriculture programs. So, you know, that.
With a little creativity.
Yeah, well, you know, and also, but it has to be measured against
Right.
effectivity and effectiveness. It's not just because somebody has a good idea. It, you know, as I said at the very beginning, it really has to have a measurable effect, and it has to be scientifically driven.
My last point, I swear, I just wanted to give kudos to the trustees, because I like when I read in the paper that you were bringing an action against some homeowners who had sort of blocked access to the beaches over on I can't remember the streets. So I don't know the details, but when I see that you're suing the homeowners in order to regain access for everyone to the beach, I say yay. So.
I'd like to discuss
Yay.
it, but that's in litigation.
Thank you for
sorry.
that.
Can you guess? Thank you.
Hi, you know me, I keep talking about our water crisis, and I thank you all for what you're trying to do in each of your ways. And it's unfortunate there's no one here from New York State, because so much of this comes down to, we have the intent, but we don't have the money to do as much as we need. And I keep trying to focus on things like monitoring and the testing that's needed. We need more test wells, we need them done faster. And so if there's anything that, you have a lot of civic representatives here, that we can do to help, or maybe work together, let's put it that way, to support each other to make that pitch. I think that's really important. One of the other issues, and I see the pictures, I know Janice and I had spoken about this earlier, sand mines. And I've been very involved in the Sandland mine. I think these are pictures, though, over here, the East Coast mine, which is right here in East Quogue. And again, the question is, what is happening, if anything, with preventing the DEC from extending these mines, letting them drill down, letting them expand them, keeping track of what is coming into the mulch, and what's being transported. There's all sorts of, there had been some resolutions to do things, but I don't know that they ever went anywhere.
Well, on the issue of the sand, like, we're back in litigation again, and so I can't really comment.
No, I
but I
understand.
have positive feelings as to the outcome. The other thing that I think, and I was talking with someone here, Ron, I think he left, that we have a legislation called the Aquifer Overlay Protection District Law. And roughly it encumbers about 2/3 of the town of Southampton, and at its core was the protection of our groundwater and our drinking water under the sole source aquifer federal designation. And that law is effective, has been somewhat effective over time, but it needs to be updated. Things like PFAS, as an example, are not chemicals that are contained in the list, and I think it needs to be updated. And this is something that I'm thinking about doing, is launching the review of that law, and to add to it and to update it and make any course corrections, because we're really working with data that was evolved 20 years ago. And I think that would go a long way to help us solidify that we have a consistent response over a consistent set of issues. And I'll talk a little bit about the Damascus property. This was something in the making almost 30, 40 years ago. And we inherited yet another problem. And what did we do about it? The good news is that in Damascus, the test results for that have been actually kind of interesting, that 38 of the wells that were tested did not have any indication of PFAS. Some did, and 4 were elevated, and 1 was a house that wasn't. Interestingly, though, 20 of the residents did not want or did not respond to sampling requests. So I think that's good news in a sense, because we don't have any idea where this came from, how it got there. It must have happened before the AOPD law was enacted, but how many of those do we have going into the future? And that's my worry. So I want to make sure that the law is updated to be able to address that, so that my counterparts 30 years from now won't be having the same question asked of them, that we can be a little bit more rigorous in our response to protecting our water quality and certainly our public health.
I thank you, John, and I thank you for looking at it as a more expansive issue. Janice, I loved when you said earlier that we need an all-of-the-above strategy, and we have to think about how we handle land issues better. I know Brookhaven is doing some of that. I love the idea. Anything that we can do to support you in that, we really appreciate. Thank you
Yeah,
very
I
much.
appreciate that. Thank you, Andrew.
Good evening, folks. Bill Kearns from East Quogue. Is there an accepted septic system that goes into a house, and is there an accepted system that works that goes into like a public building, or, you know? There are systems, so that they're not putting like the round cesspools in anymore, right?
No.
No.
Okay, so there are accepted systems that work. So, because I always hear about, we're waiting for this to be approved, we're waiting for this to be approved. Has anything been approved that works?
Five units have been approved, 5 new technologies, IA systems that Ross had alluded to.
All right, and any new house that's built require an upgraded system?
Yes, so we mandated it for the 0 to 2 in all new construction and substantial reconstruction.
Good. Another thing, you talk about replacing eelgrass and replacing clams and things of that nature. I've been to the State of the Bay speech or seminar for the last 3 or 4 years, and every year it gets worse. You know, this year I counted 11 things that Dr. Gobler brought up that were bad, and there were a couple of septic systems that will work. So I mean, the balance is kind of getting away from us. It seems that we're chasing it. So I think really, and I've thought about this because I think it's important. We're a narrow spit of land. It impacts us very greatly. You have to go to the source and not plant grass. And I mean, that's fine. That works to some degree, I guess. But you have to go to where it's coming from and stop it. You have to stop it. Thank you.
Well, yeah, you do, Bill, and it's, you know, nitrogen is a nutrient. You know, it's part of our biological system. The problem...
Not to interrupt, but I apologize. If there is something that's happening on a consistent basis that's leaching into the bay or it's impacting groundwater, we owe it to ourselves to have it stopped, whatever it takes to have it stopped.
Well, along those lines, we did a quick analysis of how many actual cesspools, not conventional sanitary systems from 1973 on, but the old, literally a ring in the ground, you know, maybe it's made out of brick, maybe it's just a hole.
Right.
There's over 15,000 homes that are still operating under old, antiquated cesspools. And so we need to get those out.
Okay. Thank you.
Are they part of the priority area then?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
In the priority area, over 15,000.
Yeah. I want to thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're up against, I'm sure you all want to go home, and we're up against a hard
No,
deadline.
I love this. Let's keep going.
If any one of you want to make any kind of last closing comments, something that touched on that you, or...
Yeah, just like to say that, you know, the trustees have employed the college and Cornell and to do projects on the bays, in the bays. And it's really important, being a fisherman, seeing a lot of issues that have come about in my lifetime from the 50s up to current, and to have them do the research and come up with the answers. You know, once you have an answer, then you can work back and solve the problem. And I think, you know, working forward, that's where, you know, we all should head.
I think the most positive thing is that everyone at this table and everyone that I work with, staff in town hall, all the local civics and local organizations, we all agree on this. This transcends any sort of barrier that we might have. And I am absolutely grateful for that people are willing to work and roll up their sleeves and are working with us. And I feel really fortunate to be here at this point in time with such people. And I have to say that I don't think that this is an unsolvable problem. I think this is something that just plain old-fashioned hard work will solve, and these are the people to do it. So, and I wanted to thank you guys all for coming out tonight. Thank you.